So, welcome after a gap of 2 weeks. I'm sorry that I was not able to take those two uh, lectures on time. I was not well. But let us resume. And today we will do the second reading from Max Weber. You will remember that we discussed Weber's very famous book, um, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And we mentioned that there was a very big project on the sociology of religion, which Weber was carrying out through the early years of the 20th century. It, in fact, remained incomplete at the time of Weber's death in 1920. But alongside, he produced, again, a very large body of writing, uh, which was then put together in 2 volumes called Economy and Society. And these included a whole uh, series of topics from economic history, specifically economic history of Europe, once again, paralleling his interest in the rise of capitalism. And then the emergence of the state, the forms of the state, etc., etc. And these he put together in these 2 volumes called Economy and Society. And the particular chapter that we will read, called Forms of Legitimate Domination, this is part of this. So let's turn to the book. Legitimate Domination. Yeah, okay. So it's important to understand what the idea of domination and authority. He is distinguishing between domination and authority. And let me remind you that this is not merely about political domination and political authority. So although clearly his main interest is in the emergence of the modern state and its specific form, but he is actually looking at this over a large span and a long period of history, where he is connecting this, the idea of domination and authority, not simply in the political realm, but really in every institution of society. So every institution of society, as we all understand, all recognize, every institution contains a certain set of practices and rules about who can command, who can order, and whose orders must be obeyed. Okay? Now, he is taking this very general sense. So he's first, in fact, as you would have noticed, even when we were discussing the Protestant ethic, Weber is following from, in fact, Durkheim has already introduced this in sociology, to actually define a concept, right? Define a concept and then deduce the implications from that concept, right? He is very much following, as Durkheim did explicitly, the rules of the physical sciences. Weber actually introduces more complicated methods, as we will see, as you know, he would call this interpretive, Now, we will see what interpretation means. But again, the first thing he has to do is to define what he means by domination and authority. So domination is the probability that commands will be obeyed. Now, there are various things to note from this definition. First of all, domination, whether or not there is domination, is to be judged by the results or consequences, right? So, how do we recognize in a particular institution that there is domination in force or in action, right? We recognize it in terms of the probability that commands will be obeyed. So somebody who is supposed to be in a position of authority issues a command, do this or don't do this. What is the probability that it will be obeyed? Now, this also means that there is a range within which domination will occur. So you will have some institutions where domination is very high, which basically means that the probability is very high that a command will in fact be obeyed. There may be other institutions where it is not so high, that commands are obeyed maybe most of the time, but not every time, right? And then you can go down. So there is a range within which this phenomenon called domination is to be identified or understood. Okay, so that is the first definition, the probability that commands will be obeyed. Now, when there is regular or habitual obedience, right? So therefore, the probability is very high that when commands are issued, they are habitually obeyed. This usually requires a belief in legitimacy. It means that people understand that the command is coming from an authority which is legitimate, right? That is to say that authority, that person or body in authority has the legitimate power to issue this order. And hence, it is our obligation, as it were, to obey. Now, that would be legitimate domination. This legitimate domination creates authority as distinct from mere power or influence. So legitimate domination, that is to say authority, is not simply the exercise of power. What is important to notice here is that Weber doesn't explicitly bring in the question of the use of force or coercion or violence, right? We will come to that question later. But it means that when an order is obeyed, if it is obeyed simply because there is a threat of the exercise of power, or in fact, there is actual power, actual violence, force, coercion that is used, right? Then it is not legitimate domination. That is not authority. Because it is not habitual obedience that comes from a belief in the legitimacy of that authority. Now, you can go to all sorts of examples. For instance, if there is a country which has been occupied by a military power, some invading power, and that invading power has enough force at its command so that people, in fact, do not resist, they obey. But that obedience does not necessarily mean that the people actually believe that that domination is legitimate. Okay, they may still obey, but it is not because of a habitual belief in the legitimacy of that authority. Okay, so authority as distinct from mere power or influence, that is legitimate domination. Again, let me remind you that this is not simply a matter of what happens in the domain of the state or politics, right? You can think of an authority inside a school, for instance, or inside some cultural organization. Even there, in a school, we all know there are persons who have the authority to order, to say, classes will be held in such and such time. This is your school uniform. This is your code of behavior. You can do this, you cannot do this, etc., etc. There are a whole range of things, correct? When these orders are obeyed, okay, not because the person in authority carries a stick and is, standing behind every student. That would not be authority, because it would mean that students actually don't have any faith in the legitimacy of that authority. On the other hand, most schools that function more or less regularly, we understand that there are teachers and headmasters and so on and so forth who have positions of authority which are legitimate. And that makes it authority as distinct from mere domination that is based on power. Okay? Now, also, don't forget that this legitimate domination need not exclude violence altogether. So, for instance, when you say that a king exercises legitimate domination, it does not mean that the king is sending out his troops, to police every house in his dominion, right? But it does mean that if there is a violation of that authority, if there is a violation of the law, then in fact, legitimately, the ruler has the authority to punish by the use of force, right? So violence of force is not necessarily excluded from the idea of authority. What is excluded is obedience secured merely through the exercise of coercive power. Okay? That is the distinction that is being made here. Okay. So it means subjection. There is some authority, could be a person, it could be a group of persons, a body, for instance, a council, something of that kind, committee, which exercises authority, and there are others who are subjects in a condition of subjection, but the subjection is legitimate. Now, not every customary or contractual obligation implies exercise of authority. Now, for instance, a factory worker demanding wages on the basis of a contract is exercising her civil rights and not authority. So when, for instance, workers say, well, these were the terms on which we were employed, we demand our wages. Our wages have not been paid for 2 months. That is not exercising authority. It is exercising civil rights, right? On the basis of a contract, or that this is not just customary, it's a contractual, exercising rights. And so therefore, in that relationship, there is no authority involved. So between the factory owners and the factory worker, in this case, there is no authority involved. It's a contractual relationship of involving work and wages. But once inside the factory, the worker is subject to the authority of a supervisor. Basically, so to say, once inside the factory, the worker is obliged, and under normal circumstances, the worker would, in fact, legitimately accept the authority of the supervisor. So when the supervisor directs the worker to do this or that, or do it this way or that way, the worker will obey, because there is an implicit understanding that the supervisor has legitimate authority in this case. We will see what this authority is based on, because that is where Weber will distinguish between three different kinds of authority. We'll come to this in a minute. Similarly, members of the armed forces or bureaucracy are subject to the authority of their seniors, but are free to join and leave the service. So again, note what is the element of free choice and what is the element of subjection, right? The free choice is that anyone is free to join the army. No one is being forced into the army or into the bureaucracy. One is also free to leave service. But once within that service, the authority of the seniors has to be obeyed. Those are the terms, okay? And so in some ways, you could think of this as a free person leaving the freedoms of a purely civic kind, the civil freedoms. You leave it outside and join an institution which has its own code of authority, and you accept subjection to that code when you voluntarily join. Okay, so such relations of authority and subjection are regarded as legitimate by law or custom. And we'll see where it is law and where it is custom. But for instance, are there not illegitimate exercises? Yes, of course, we'll come to this in a minute, because even within the army, you could say certain kinds of commands are not legitimate. That will depend entirely upon the internal rules of the armed forces. Similarly, in the bureaucracy, right? There are certain kinds of things a senior officer can ask a junior staff to do, but not other things. And it's very clearly specified what kinds of things can be expected or can be commanded, and what kinds of things cannot be commanded. But those are the specific rules of that institution. But within those rules, there is a structure of authority on the one side and subjection on the other side, which is determined or legitimized, made legitimate by law, that is to say, explicit rules, or customary and conventions, right? There are many institutions where, of course, generally speaking, in terms of most modern institutions, we expect these kinds of rules to be explicitly formulated in terms of written laws, rules, etc. But we will see that there are many traditional institutions, for instance. For instance, the way, let us say, a religious institution runs. Let us say a temple. And what are the things that can or cannot be done, in the precincts of a temple or a religious establishment? Now, many of those are not necessarily written down as rules or law. They are customary, right? It is customary that you do this or not do this, or you go there but not go somewhere else. So these are customary, and we will look at the possible variations between the types of legitimate authority which depend upon what kind of legitimation is involved here. So, so much for the definition of what is domination or exercise of power and what is legitimate exercise of power or domination, which would amount to legitimate authority. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So then Weber makes the most crucial analytical move, 3 pure types of authority. And once again, remember Weber's very well-known method of interpretive sociology or interpretive. And that method of interpretation is to set up what he calls the ideal type, right? For every type, instead of what Durkheim had suggested, which was the average, right? Durkheim follows an extremely empirical method. So, for instance, for any particular type, let's say, think of the phenomenon of in his case, for instance, suicide or crime, okay? If you have to define what is crime or what is suicide, Durkheim's rule is, take the most prevalent, the most common or average. And that is the normal, okay, the norm. And then there will be variations from the norm. But the norm is set by what is the most prevalent or common phenomenon. Weber does not accept this. For Weber, he's working with more conceptual categories rather than purely empirically defined categories. Okay, conceptual. And the conceptual category is that of the ideal type. What is the pure form? And then you can identify hybrids, mixtures, deviations from the ideal type. All of that is possible because whenever you look at a real world phenomenon, you will not necessarily find the ideal. But the ideal is your conceptual guide, right? Analytically, you have a certain concept which is given by an ideal type. You look for the ideal type, you won't find the ideal, but the ideal will help you to recognize what is characteristic of that particular institution or practice or whatever it is that you are looking at. So 3 pure types of authority: rational, legal, traditional, and charismatic. These are classic Weberian categories or types. Okay, what is the rational legal? It's the belief in legality, in the legality of rules that create the right of authority to issue commands. So rational legal authority is when the authority to issue commands stems from rules that are believed to be legal, legally correct. Okay, so we will see very soon that the most characteristic authority, the institution embodying rational legal authority is the bureaucracy. In fact, as Weber will say, the basic form of bureaucracy will infiltrate not simply the modern state, but every institution of modern society has a basic form where authority is defined in terms of rational legal rules. So again, you take a school, you take even sort of cultural organizations, a club, for instance, and even there, as you will see, any club or any society, right, uh, is organized in terms of certain sets of rules, which are very often clearly written down to say, there will be a committee, a president, a secretary, a treasurer, right? There may well be actually periodic elections by the members. There will be rules about who can become a member, how one becomes a member, right? All of those things that is specifically rational legal. So when the secretary of an organization says that so and so has violated the rules of the society, right, and should be either suspended or even thrown out of the society, all of those kinds of things, or let us say the subscription is raised from so much to so much, will it be obeyed? It will be obeyed if it is understood that whoever has issued this command has the authority to do so, because it has been done according to the rules of that institution. This is rational legal authority. Okay, so the foundation of that authority, legitimacy of that authority, lies in the legality of the rules. Now, tradition, authority. This is not necessarily about written rules. It is the sanctity of immemorial traditions that legitimize authority. It is believed that there are traditions, customary practices, which go back immemorial very often. So traditional it goes back to a past that is not even within one's direct memory. In other words, a very ancient past, or at least sufficiently distant in time as to be immemorial, right? So you do not say in terms of tradition. So think of tradition. Let's say, what is the authority of the Brahmin in even modern society? If the Brahmin comes to, let's say, perform a certain puja, and the Brahmin says, well, this has to be done this way in terms of ritual rules. Okay? Now, most people there will have no idea of whether or not there are actually written down rules for this. If there are, where those have been written down, or what the content of those scriptural instructions may or may not be. People accept the legitimacy of the Brahmin because by tradition, and this tradition goes back a long, long time. Now, historians may go back and give a date for it. In this region, it was at this kind of time that the authority of the Brahmins was established by, under such and such a king, etc., etc. You can have specific historical accounts of this. But as far as the observance of that practice is concerned, right, the legitimate obedience to that authority is concerned, it is understood to be tradition. It is understood to be tradition. So it is understood that the Brahmin priest in this situation has legitimate authority by tradition. This is not rational legal. Okay, this is traditional. We will come to the let's say the authority of dynastic kings, for instance. Where does that come from? A large part of it could be traditional, although very often it is mixed with rational legal. And so you will get hybrid or mixed types, not pure types. But we will come to this in a minute. So that's the second kind of authority. The third is what cannot be captured by either of those two. And that Weber calls charismatic. Now, charismatic is by definition outside the rules, outside tradition. It simply happens. It is devotion to exceptional sanctity, heroism, or exemplary character of authority. It attaches to a person. It attaches to a person. A person is believed to have some exceptional sanctity. It could be, and we look at the various possibilities, it could be because of a belief in some kind of, divine sanction, right? It could be because of certain kinds of magical power, possibly, all right? Or exceptional heroism, exceptional, or some character, exemplary character, which is truly, all of these is understood to be exceptional and therefore outside the rules, outside, custom or what is understood to be conventional. So the charismatic authority is not conventional. Charismatic authority is not rule-bound. It is outside all of those, well understood forms of authority. It is, as it were, something that comes up in itself, right? An authority which is, and therefore, in every sense, exceptional. And again, we will see the possibilities that of where, in which institutions. Again, this is this could happen in the domain of politics, but it also happens in other domains as well, right? And of course, each of these three we will look at in more detail now. So as you could notice from the picture there, we are very familiar with this kind of authority, pure rational legal authority, right? For which the standard term is bureaucracy. But when we say bureaucracy, we normally understand that as something to do with the state or with government. But this rational legal authority is not confined only to the domain of government. It as Weber himself will point out, in modern societies, it pervades virtually every institution. What does it involve? A consistent system of abstract rules applied to particular cases, with the person in authority himself being subject to an impersonal order. Now, it's important to understand what this involves. There is a person, within this form of authority, there is a person in authority, an authority who has the power to issue commands which others will obey. But where does that authority come from? It comes from a system of rules, abstract rules, but applied to particular cases. Again, a very important thing, that rational legal authority, the rules, there are rules, and rules are applied in particular cases. Every case is not necessary, so it's not necessarily case by case. Okay, so for instance, if once again think of an educational institution and think of a particular case of, or a particular charge of indiscipline, right, on the part of, let us say, a student, indiscipline. Now, when we say abstract rules applied to particular cases, it means that that charge will have to be decided upon, and then the necessary action will be decided on the basis of certain abstract rules. You do not say, oh, is it so and so who has done this? In that case, this is the action. The action will not vary case by case. It will not vary according to who has been charged. It must be an abstract rule. So the rule must be about in the nature of an indiscipline. Okay, let us say something like plagiarism, or even more simple, absence from class. When there is a charge of this kind, the person in authority must actually follow an abstract rule. There must be an abstract rule which lays down what is the obligation of the students to attend classes. So we all know there are many, many institutions. It may vary. Sometimes it will say you have to attend at least 75% of classes or 80% of classes. Or it could be even stricter. You say, if you do not, or if you are unable to attend a class, you need to inform and take permission for not attending a class. Okay, if that is the abstract rule, then it does not vary from one student to another. It's the same rule, only it is applied to cases, right? And the person in authority is also subject to an impersonal order. So again, if you come back to the example of the school, it's the teacher in class who may have the authority to exercise a certain degree of command over her students, but she also is subject to an impersonal order. In other words, she is also subject to rules. She must follow a set of rules which are prescribed for all teachers. And then, if there is a violation, there will be a senior person within that hierarchy who will have the authority to issue a command or a stricture or a punishment. Okay? It may go in an institution, there may be a final head of the institution, a principal, a headmaster, or whatever it is. But that person is also subject to some higher authority. Okay, so this is the crucial argument about rational legal authority, that every person in authority is subject to the rules. Okay, there is exercise of power, there is exercise of command, of domination, but that domination is legitimate because there is a set of rules which is impersonal and which applies to every single person within that institution, irrespective of the position. Even the person occupying the highest position is also subject to rules. So what are the specific characteristics then of pure rational legal authority? I've more or less mentioned several of them already, but let us enumerate them as Weber does. Continuous rule-bound conduct of official business. Rule-bound, all official business is continuously conducted in a rule-bound fashion. And once again, it's not that we will follow rules for this period and then there's a period when there are no rules. It is continuous, okay, endless. 2, specified jurisdiction, very crucial. The teacher in class has a certain jurisdiction. That class teacher cannot, as class teacher, take actions or issue commands outside that jurisdiction. It may be just the class. That teacher cannot commands students who are in a different class, right? Similarly, even all the way going up to, as I said, the highest position in authority also has a defined jurisdiction. It's a very crucial part of rational legal bureaucracy. Jurisdictions are defined. 4th, rational specialized training. So within every rule-bound institution, there is an understanding that those who occupy positions of authority have been trained in the rules, okay? Trained to follow the rules. So this is certainly true in modern bureaucracies proper. Okay, so from the sort of lowest positions to all the clerical, secretarial staff, to all the officers who command, managers, and so on, everybody is meant to go through initial and then periodic training, specialized training in their jobs. Okay, rational training. Fifth, administration is separated from ownership. Very crucial. This is different from rational legal bureau. We will come to the whole question about private corporations and so on, even in modern societies. Administration separated from ownership. Now, in a modern bureaucracy, right, every office has an administration. The person in charge of that office does not have any authority of ownership of that office, right? Even the most, respected or authoritarian officer cannot, within a proper bureaucracy, cannot exercise ownership of that office. An office is a charge, right? Again, within those rules, as soon as one's tenure is over, the charge is handed over to the next person. There is no ownership here. Okay? Administration separated from ownership. We know, for instance, those who've studied history, for instance, would know, for instance, in India in older times, for instance, in Mughal times, there was a bureaucracy, very well known as a bureaucracy. But a lot of those offices, they were, in a sense, owned by the person who was given charge of that office, right? In other words, so for instance, it is very true that a lot of the official papers and so on would in fact be kept in the home of the person who was in charge. Okay, there would often be a kind of personal staff who would do all the official work on behalf of that person in authority. And there was often not much distinction between the office and ownership of that office. In fact, sometimes they even became hereditary. So, the person in charge would often hand over that office to the next generation, to a son, for instance. And so what was originally an office would become hereditary. The rational form of legal authority, which is characteristic of the modern bureaucracy, would absolutely not allow for this, right? Which basically means separate the person from the office, right? Incumbent cannot appropriate the office. All transactions in writing and recorded. Once again, this is very crucial for a rational legal authority because it is supposed to be rule bound, so that the idea of why and for what reasons and what exactly is an order, why was that order given, on what basis was that order given, all of this is meant to be recorded so that it does not become arbitrary or a personal act. It has to be an official act. Every official act is meant to be transparent. Now, not everybody may be privileged to actually inspect that record. As we know that many institutions, certain kinds of decisions are kept confidential. Only a certain set of people may have the authority to look at it. So those depend once again on the rules of that institution. But the idea must be that rules, that decisions are according to rules. And in order for that decision to be not purely subjective and arbitrary, the decision and all the considerations that go behind that decision must be put down in writing and recorded so that someone else from outside that particular office, if that person is given the charge, can actually come in and find out if in fact that order was according to the rules or not. Think of what is going on right now, as we see almost every day in the papers and on television, about the way in which primary school teachers were appointed or not appointed, or whether or not they were according to the rules and so on. Now the whole question has come down, as we can see every day. What are the records? The court is demanding, show me the records. And are the records in proper order? Were they written down properly? Now, all this is being done on the basis of precisely the logic of a rational legal bureaucracy. Since the School Service Commission is meant to be a rational legal bureaucracy, its decisions must be subject to this impersonal order. It is not up to a particular official to say, well, I was given the authority, this is what I did, I am not obliged to explain. That official is, in fact, obliged to explain. And that explanation must lie in the written documentation. Okay, so this is the logic. So since it is understood that this is what is being followed, the rule bound, then the orders that come from such an institution are likely to be followed because people have faith in the legitimacy of that order. They know that that order, let's say the appointments that have been issued, have been done according to the rules, following the laid down procedure. It has not been or corrupt. When that legitimacy collapses, then the authority of that institution also breaks down. So people would not obey the orders of that institution habitually because they do not have faith that the orders have been issued on the basis of the proper rules, right? So these are the basic characteristics. And this is what Weber will repeatedly characterize as rational authority. Rational because it is impersonal. It is not subjective. Hence, it must be justified. Every order is justified by its adherence to a set of consistent rules. That is what is rational. Okay, it is not purely matter of fancy. Okay. Now, what does this mean in terms of the actual acts of authority, the way in which authority functions? Officials are personally free. So again, think of this. This is the distinction between the person and the office. Personally, officials are free. So therefore, an official within the office, that official is subject to authority only with respect to their impersonal obligations. Whatever is related to the functions of that office, okay, in that, in that respect, they are subject to the superior authority. So let us say a clerical staff in a government office who walks in, following the rules. She has followed the rules. She is doing her work. What she does after work, when she leaves office, right? Whom she meets, whether or not she goes to watch a movie, which movie she watches, none of that has anything to do with her duties in the office. There are no obligations there. Personally, that official or that staff member is personally free. Nothing about her personal life can be subject to an order from the office. Okay? So it's only with respect to their impersonal obligations in relation to their work. Only that is what she is obliged to obey, to follow. There is a clearly defined hierarchy of officers. As we all know from experience, there is a notion of the superior officer within a hierarchy. Jurisdictions are defined, the authorities are defined, who has the authority to direct whom, where must one complain if there is a complaint about somebody's work. So clearly defined spheres of jurisdiction. There is a free contractual basis of selection. Who gets selected to join a rational bureaucracy? There is a contractual basis, right? It's on the basis. So no one is compelled to join a rational bureaucratic organization. One joins freely. There could well be, and almost invariably, this goes with the question of training. There could well be a process of selection which involves, examination, interviews, some kind of test of one's required skills, etc., suitability for the job. All of that is part of the process of selection. But the selection itself or the appointment is contractual. One also joins for a particular period of time. For instance, it could be a particular span of time, or it could be up to a particular age when one retires, etc. It's appointed, not elected. Okay, this is a very important thing we will see later, for instance, when you get more hybrid kinds of organizations, that even in many modern governments, there are certain positions in the bureaucracy which are appointed like this. There are others where people are elected to an office. And of course, the classic ones in parliamentary forms of government, for instance, in our case, there are a set of ministers and so on are elected. Although they will, once elected and once having joined a particular position, one becomes subject to rational legal authority. Ministers too have a set of rule-bound practices within which they must operate. But the difference between the minister who is elected and the career bureaucrat who is appointed, right, is that the minister is only there for the period for which that person is elected. So very often it could be that the next election that person is defeated, or the party decides that you can no longer be minister and you leave, right? That is not a question of free joining or leaving. Okay, election is a different. In the presidential system, in the American system, a very large number of officials are in fact elected. So that, for instance, in the United States, there are, particularly in the states, there are many officials, including police officials, judges, who are elected, right? Not appointed through a bureaucratic system. They are elected. And so judges will have to continue to run for elections and may be defeated and lose the position of judge. Or, for instance, things like sheriffs, police officials, many of them are elected. Okay. Within a rational legal bureaucracy, again, there are fixed salaries according to rules and contract. In other words, the salary of a person, whichever rung of the hierarchy, is fixed. It is not subject to the discretion of some superior authority. This will be very different from the other kinds of traditional authority, for instance, where a lot of the salaries and perquisites of officials will be entirely at the discretion of the superior authority, right? Whereas in a rational legal bureaucracy, salaries or emoluments and the terms of conditions of service are all fixed. A particular rung, so for instance, in the Indian case, we all have grades of pay. Depending on where in the hierarchy you are placed, you have a certain grade of pay, and your pay is fixed. It does not depend upon the whims of some superior officer. Okay. The office is the sole primary occupation. Once again, this is a very important principle of rational bureaucracy, that your occupation, the principal occupation, is that office. You do not share your work in the office with 2 or 3 other jobs somewhere else, okay, which may have nothing to do with your office job. You are free to do anything else outside the terms or the hours obligations of your office work. But so outside that, you are free to do whatever you want to do. But you cannot have a second or third primary occupation. Office is the sole primary occupation of the bureaucrat. It constitutes, in other words, a career. This is very important implications in terms of training, skills, the development of authority. Okay, because it is understood that one is in a career, and so one develops one's experience, one's skill. Experience is a very important factor within any bureaucracy, as one understands. this one knows from. And experience can only come if, in fact, it is a career. Okay, so over time, as one moves from one level of the office to another within that institution, one gains experience and one acquires greater authority, therefore, so that one's commands, one's orders are likely to be obeyed by others, because they also know that this person has had so many years of experience, etc., etc. Separated from ownership and without appropriation of the position. I've already explained this. So ownership and office is separated. The person appointed to the office does not own the office. Subject to the discipline and control in his office. Right? Whatever are the rules within that hierarchy, subject to discipline and control. Formal authority of a single head is the most common type now. It's not necessary, but it has Weber is making this observation that over time it is usually the case that every office or every institution, there is the formal authority of a single head. This is because of the need for rapid, clear decisions without compromise between different opinions. Now, again, Weber is not necessarily making this a characteristic of the pure type of bureaucracy, because you can have, in principle, you can have decisions made by committee, right? You can have decisions made by consultation. You can have decisions made on the basis of voting in a committee. All of that is possible. It is not ruled out as long as it's all within a set of clearly understood rules. But the tendency is, Weber says, to authorize a single head of a particular office to take the final decision. There could be any number of stages of consultation, but the decision finally comes from a single person, a single authorized person, because there is a need for rapid, clear decisions without saying, well, this was a decision that was opposed by a large part of the office, although the majority did support it. That would actually lessen the legitimacy of that decision. Okay. And so even if there were differences about a particular decision, finally, it is the authority of a single person. That decision is taken to be the decision of the entire office involved. Okay. This has come to be, as Weber says, the most common type. Bureaucracy is the most rational form of authority known. Rational for all of these reasons. Okay, because non-arbitrary, rule-bound, okay, not subjective. So therefore, it is the most rational form of authority. It is domination through technical knowledge. It is domination. Orders are issued, they are obeyed, but they are obeyed on the understanding that those who are issuing that order know what they're doing. They know their business. They have been trained, they are experienced, right? It is because of experience that they have come to that position where they are issuing this order. And so it is on the basis of whatever is the technical knowledge in that particular office, whatever that office is dealing with, okay? It is domination through knowledge, through technical knowledge. This obviously is the ground on which expertise is built. We'll come later when we discuss Foucault about the role of experts, rule by experts, etc., and why particular specialized forms of expertise become important precisely within this form of rational legal authority. It now prevails in all institutions of modern life. This is Weber's observation. It is not just about bureaucracy, it's not only about government. All institutions of modern life, government, business, armed forces, education, trade unions, political parties, social and cultural organizations, even political parties themselves have their own bureaucracy. Trade unions have their bureaucracy. And all forms of modern institutions, this is understood to be the most rational and therefore the most legitimate form of authority. Okay, so it prevails in all institutions of modern life. Only two major occupations are outside the sphere of bureaucratic organization. And Weber is talking about his period. So let's say, early 20th century Europe. The peasantry, to the extent that there was still a peasantry in Europe, the peasantry are completely outside bureaucratic life. Peasant organization, the way in which a peasant household is organized, the way production is organized, the way calculations are made about, daily or monthly expenses, about the division of labor within the family, and so on and so forth. This is not about rational organization. So this is outside the domain of rational of bureaucratic organization. And secondly, the owner of a capitalist enterprise. Very interesting that Weber makes this an exception. So, and of course, Weber is thinking here not of the large public corporations, which were only just about coming up in this period. He is speaking of the capitalist owner of a business firm, right? It could be a shop, a trading organization, it could be a factory, etc. But an owner, a single owner, or a family which owns. And that owner or family is outside bureaucratic authority. Because to the extent that the owner owns as private property the institution, okay, that position of ownership, there can be no separation between ownership and office, right? So in a sense then, within a business organization, if it is in fact the case that there is a single proprietor of that organization, then the entire organization may be subject to bureaucratic authority, except the owner at the top. That owner is not subject to bureaucratic organization. So the owner, in fact, exercising the right of private property can, for instance, tomorrow decide to sell the organization. The employees, the staff, and so on have nothing to say. That selling of that organization may or may not have anything to do with a rational decision, right? So an owner of a private company may suddenly decide, well, I don't want to continue in business life at all, right? I'm going to retire in the south, in some South Sea island. So I'm selling off my company. This may not be a rational decision. None of this is subject to any kind of supervision by somebody else. It is simply the exercise of private ownership. So here, office and ownership cannot be separated in this case. Of course, as we know, increasingly large corporations will not necessarily have single owners. There are many corporations, even today, for instance, which has boards of directors which are not necessarily controlled by a single person or even a single family, right? They are very often career managers who manage these companies, right? On the basis of a board, which is, of course, consists of various people, and on the basis of their shareholders, who may be much larger in number. So that is a different kind of construction, where again, you could argue that in those kinds of organizations, the board of directors, the chief executive, is certainly subject to rational bureaucratic authority. But Weber is treating as the exception the private owner of a capitalist enterprise, because that private ownership of an institution is outside the domain of rational legal bureaucracy. He also makes this very interesting argument about socialism. And remember, Weber dies in 1920. He's just seen the Bolshevik Revolution, but the forms of large-scale socialism practices, for instance, in the Soviet Union or elsewhere, Weber has not seen it. He's simply anticipating. But even socialism must depend on rational bureaucracy, perhaps more than capitalism, he's suggesting, because in a socialist system, right, the idea of private ownership is not the dominant element, right? Enterprises are owned by the state or by some kind of collective ownership. And in a situation like that, you can only have legitimate authority if it is according to certain kinds of rational bureaucratic principles. And in fact, as we know, for instance, the Soviet Union, the role of bureaucracy became much, much bigger than in any capitalist society, because the entire state, the entire economy, even culture came to be run by bureaucrats, because it is bureaucrats who best represented the legitimate authority of a collective. How can a collective actually run a factory or an enterprise or an entire economy, right? And so it's inevitably expert bureaucracies which became the most important authority in that society to have legitimacy. You can think of this, for instance, if you look at India, for instance, soon after independence, the role of something like the Planning Commission, which is appointed, not elected. Very interesting, right? So you have elected ministers and so on who are supposed to be politically in charge, but appointed bodies like the Planning Commission actually had enormous control over the way in which state finances would be spent, where factories would be set up, what would be pricing, the distribution of resources. All of this came to be decided by an expert body of the Planning Commission and its various advisory bodies and so on in that entire period of planning, from the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so that is, in a sense, what Weber is suggesting is that even in a situation where you're supposed to have elected officials, right, a large part of collective decision-making, in order to become legitimate, had to be handed over to an expert bureaucracy, because that embodied a rational form, the most rational form of authority, which was likely to elicit obedience from the people. Questions on bureaucracy, because then now we can move on to the second kind, which is traditional authority. Any questions on the bureaucracy? Okay, so then we move on to the second pure type, which is traditional authority. Authority is traditional if legitimacy is claimed on the basis of the sanctity of age-old rules and powers. Okay, as I said, conventions, practices that come down from over a long time, right, from a distant past. It is well understood what those conventions are, what those rules are, and if a particular authority has followed those well understood traditions, then that authority is taken to be legitimate. Now, there are no formally enacted rules. So it's not as if there is some body which has passed laws which are put down in writing, right? There are no formally enacted rules. Commands are based on personal pleasure, obedience not to rules, but to the person in authority. Now, very interesting that even in, and this is where we are coming up to questions of mixed types. So, whereas modern states are primarily based on rational legal authority, you still have, in many of these cases, traces of traditional authority, right? Which remain part of a modern bureaucratic state structure. So, for instance, take the idea of constitutional monarchs, right? Take Britain, for instance, where we've just seen a transfer of authority from one monarch to another. A queen died, and so the son was made king with coronation and everything. Now, what was that based on? There is no written constitution or anything which prescribes any of this. This is based upon tradition, right? It is understood to be the tradition of British monarchy, that this is how authority is transferred from one generation to the next, right? Commands. Now, this is interesting. Formally speaking, in a constitutional monarchy, the monarch is obliged to follow the advice of his or her minister, right? Because it is a parliamentary democratic system. So Parliament passes a law, the ministers approve it, they take that law to the monarch, but it becomes law only when the monarch puts his or her signature to it. Now, it is understood that this is exercising the pleasure of the monarch. It is technically possible for a monarch not to sign. We don't know what would happen if some monarch insisted on not signing. But it is understood to be that is the exercise of pleasure. Very often, the appointment of a prime minister is according to the pleasure of the monarch. There were occasions, let us say, earlier in the 20th century, when in a situation where it was not clear which party had a majority and therefore which leader of the party would in fact should become the prime minister, it's the monarch who actually chose. And that came to be accepted. Because in fact it is understood that that is a kind of residual power of the monarch, which is traditional, which is it would be respected because it is understood as a tradition. Now, in India, for instance, it's one of the oddities because of following the British parliamentary system. In the Indian case, of course, there is nothing corresponding to the monarch, but there is an elected president. Okay, but even the Constitution says, following the British precedent, the Constitution says that the Council of Ministers shall hold office during the pleasure of the President. Pleasure of the President. This term pleasure is a carryover from traditional authority. Okay, of course, in the Indian case, there is no tradition which gives any kind of powers to an elected president. There was no such thing. This is a completely new constitutional innovation. But the innovation had to be made in order for that constitutional system to become consistent with the British one, from which it was supposedly adopted. Okay, you have seriously problematic situations in the state governments in India, for instance, where the governor has exactly the same position. So the Council of Ministers in a state holds office during the pleasure of at the pleasure of the governor. And very often, as we know, the governor has exercised that power to appoint this and not that person as a chief minister. We have had so many disputes over this, even right now, we will have disputes over this from time to time. Dismissing a government, because there is a clear term, even in our constitution, which gives the governor, or as the head of state in this case, right, this traditional authority of exercising pleasure. Now, this, of course, goes back to a form of authority where authority is not based on rules. Authority is based on traditional practices, right, which give complete discretionary power, personal. It's the person who has authority. Now, are there no principles? Yes, of course there are principles. Because not every act of discretion will necessarily have the same effect of legitimacy, right? Traditional authorities follow principles of ethical common sense, equity, or expedience. So there could well be a commonly understood sense of fairness. Is a particular decision of the traditional authority fair? Is it equitable? Is it ethical? In other words, is it just? Now, people may well have their own ideas on this. And if it is understood by a large number of people that in fact it is not equitable or fair or just, then it could arouse the resistance of their subjects. So the idea of exercising traditional authority, it is not, even though it is discretionary and subjective and arbitrary, but it is not necessarily unprincipled. There are good ways or ethical ways of exercising traditional authority, which would follow principles of ethical common sense, equity, or expediency. Sometimes it is purely expediency, without arousing the resistance of their subjects. If it doesn't do this, then resistance occurs against the person of the master or his staff when subjects believe traditional norms have been violated. So you have lots and lots of instances, for instance. Look at instances from Indian history itself, where the Praja have resisted orders issued in the name of the king or orders by the king, because it was understood that traditional norms have not been followed, right? And the traditional norms may well be codified according to some understanding of dharma. Okay, so if the king has done something which is considered to be adharma, not according to dharma, then of course the subjects are not obliged, or they feel not obliged to obey an adharmic king or some officials of the king who are supposedly acting on the king's orders, right? So traditional authority is not necessarily completely perverse. If it becomes perverse, then it cannot have authority. how does traditional authority continue to have legitimacy? It continues to have legitimacy when people believe that, in fact, traditional norms of um, of legitimate behavior, traditional norms of the way in which the person in authority should act, those norms have been followed. If people come to believe that they have not been followed, that they've been violated, then in fact, traditional authority will collapse. Okay? Now, traditional authorities often, for instance, large institutions like a large state, for instance, sometimes large religious establishments also, they have staff, right, officials, in the simple form of a gerontocracy, that is to say, the rule of elders. The master has personal staff. So you often have, for instance, village councils in the old days, sometimes even now, caste councils. They are rules of elders, tribal council, rule of elders, and the elder person, the elders who have authority, will often have personal staff. This is completely a relation of master to servants. Okay? In more developed forms, the administrative staff is recruited patrimonially by inheritance. That is to say, they, for instance, think of a king handing over power to the next successor. A king dies, for instance, the successor comes to power. There is an inherited body of staff who come down from the previous king. Okay, this is patrimonial. It's often kinsmen, sometimes slaves, for instance, in many Islamic kingdoms. Bureaucrats were in fact slaves, but they were experts, trained in particular bureaucratic jobs, sometimes in the army, for instance, or dependents, etc. So this is patrimonially inherited stuff, or extra patrimonially through these would be personal favorites, vassals, and they would be personally loyal to this authority. So there are both kinds. One, which are staff that is inherited from tradition, from the traditional institution, and staff that is purely personal. The person who comes to occupy an office of authority would pick their personal favorites as their staff. In this kind of staffing of a traditional institution, most features of rational bureaucracy are absent. Most of them. It's not necessarily all of them are absent, but most would be absent. Household officials and favorites rarely have technical training. A cadre of technical trained staff could emerge, as it did in China, for instance, the famous mandarins, who were, of course, over a long period of time, there was these were scholars, there was a set of, there's a kind of training which went behind it. They had to appear for examinations, and then they were included within an imperial establishment of bureaucrats or bureaucratic staff. So this is exceptional, but it could happen, right? Technically trained. The rational bureaucratic status of the group, it comes to qualify the personal power of the ruler. That is to say, when there is a kind of body of experts, of expert bureaucracy, trained staff, attached to the traditional institutional order, then the purely personal authority of the person in charge comes to be limited by the authority of that trained bureaucracy. They will come to occupy positions of advisors and so on, and very often the person in authority would in fact feel compelled to accept the authority of these trained bureaucrats, who of course, purely because of their training, experience, etc. All these are characteristics of rational bureaucracy. They will come to limit the personal authority of the traditional ruler. This you could see this happening, for instance, in the Catholic Church over from medieval times, right, where there is a church establishment which experience career officials with a hierarchy and so on, which emerges. Again, similar in some ways, but as he says, most features of rational bureaucracy will still be absent. What are the characteristics of traditional authority? Traditional authority can have administration and military that become personal instruments of the master. This takes the form of patrimonialism, that's to say, an inherited administration, an inherited military, or what Weber calls sultanism, which obviously he takes from various Islamic monarchies, which is purely personal discretion. That is to say, an administration where the key officials are personally selected by the Sultan, or the key military officials are personally selected from among the Sultan's personally loyal favorites. Traditional authority is usually characterized by arbitrariness, which of course is the opposite of rational bureaucracy. How much or what kinds of economic activity is possible under traditional authority? Only certain kinds of capitalist activity are possible under traditional authority. These are trading, traders. There are, as we know, let's say in medieval Europe, for instance, pre-modern, in pre-British India, there were traders, large traders, often very prosperous traders, long-distance trading, and so on. There could be tax farming. Tax farming meaning, a particular area is given out to a particular authority who promises to raise a certain amount in taxes, right? So now that could become a kind of business. Again, tax farming is well known. Even in India, you had tax farming in the late Mughal period, in the early company period. Tax farming. Lease and sale of offices. This is interesting. This is not something which can happen in Russian bureaucracies. The sale of offices or the lease of offices. So a particular government office, which involves, let us say, maintaining law and order or raising taxes, is sold. Now, in a rational bureaucratic order, if something like this happens, we would think of it as corruption. So, for instance, it is sometimes alleged that, for instance, certain positions in the police force are sold. Right? There is often an informal auction so that people in the police force who want to be posted in a particular place, in a particular office, because of the possibilities of making more money on the side. Not through salaries, of course, salaries and so on are fixed, but additional amounts acquired through corrupt means, then offices are sold. Of course, this is completely contrary to the principle of rational bureaucracy. But in traditional authorities, this was often the case, right? That an office, even for instance, the office of a judge, the office of a tax collector, could often be sold or leased, right, to the bidder. So somebody comes in and says, well, I will pay so much to the authority and give me that office. Okay. There could be capitalist provision of supplies for the state and for war. So, for instance, this was often the case in pre-modern forms of where the state, pre-modern states, where, for instance, supplying the army or supplying various provisions within the state machinery, right, was given out to people who essentially did this as a form of business, of making money, right? And they became experts, sort of, they became professionals in this, right? There were some cases where there were plantations of a certain kind, which was more or less, it could be capitalist. But the crucial problem, this is what Weber will keep pointing out, the element of arbitrary discretion in traditional authority makes it difficult to rationalize economic activity on the basis of calculable obligations to the state. So, for instance, if it is not predictable how much, for instance, taxes a trader would have to pay, what would be the obligations to the ruler of a trader, then the kind of rational economic activity that proper capitalist enterprise demands, that cannot be carried out because it is unpredictable. So, for instance, one of the things that kept happening in the Mughal period or even the early company period, right, was that rulers would often impose various kinds of demands on, especially on wealthy merchants, traders, bankers, and so on, because the ruler was short of money, and so there would be a command, pay up so much, completely unanticipated. And of course, this kind of demand, not, and therefore this would again create all kinds of irrational practices of, let us say, some traders who become politically close to the traditional authority and others who are regarded from as being distant, and accordingly the obligations to the state will vary. Now, this is contrary to rational business activity, and so the full rationalization of economic activities which capitalist enterprise demands, the kind of capitalist enterprise that Weber has described, right? If state authorities are not rationalized at the same time, in the same way, then the calculability of economic obligations, which is absolutely essential for capitalist enterprise, that cannot happen. And so this is a limit. Traditional authority necessarily poses a limit to how much capitalism can actually be practiced under traditional authority. Finally, the last type is outside both rational bureaucracy as well as tradition, and that is charismatic authority. Charisma is purely personal exceptionalism. Charisma is a personal quality considered extraordinary, endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or specially exceptional powers. Charismatic authority can occur in many different societies. It often originates in what is believed to be a miracle. All right, somebody emerges because they, and of course one can think of, religious charismatic authority, including all the great prophets and so on. Invariably, you have stories about miraculous births, miraculous powers that they often exhibit, which become signs that these are people who are somehow extraordinary and therefore deserve to be obeyed. Okay, it is based on complete personal devotion to the leader, arising out of enthusiasm or despair and hope. Okay, somebody will be the savior, which is a very common way of regarding people with charismatic authority. And it can, again, it need not only be in matters of politics. As we all know, charismatic authority, very often in the religious sphere, there are many examples of, authoritative figures who emerge because they are believed to be charismatic, because they have some special, extraordinary powers. Okay. Charismatic authority is contrary to rational bureaucratic authority. Leaders and followers can form a charismatic community tied by emotional bonds. In fact, the whole understanding of charismatic authority, the role of emotions become much more prominent than in rational bureaucracy. Rational bureaucracy is not supposed to indulge in emotional behavior because it is rule-bound. So also in terms of traditional authorities, where tradition or traditional practice, the sanctity of practice is what's important. It's not some sudden spontaneous spirit of emotional attachment. That happens in the case of charismatic powers. Charismatic authority is irrational because it is outside all formal rules. There is no rational system of appointments or technical training or fixed salaries or anything of that kind. The charismatic leader or prophet or military leader or political leader, it can be any of these kinds, presents and demands new obligations, right? Recognition of these obligations becomes a kind of duty. So there is a relationship between leader and follower. The leaders and followers form a kind of community. And the recognition of the authority of the leader becomes the duty of the followers. Charismatic authority is sharply opposed to both bureaucratic and traditional authority. It can sometimes be revolutionary because it repudiates the past. So it can set aside traditional rules. It can set aside the rules of bureaucracy. So very often, for instance, charismatic leaders will promise or can be expected to deliver results, right? Which traditional authority cannot do, because traditional authorities are often circumscribed by rules of tradition, patrimonial, inherited rules. You cannot do anything outside of it. Whereas a charismatic leader can say, well, hell with it, right? I will do this. I will deliver this. Similarly, for rational rules, very often it could be understood that the rules stand in the way of substantive justice, because the rules prescribe this long process of following procedure, and the procedures delay things. They can often end up not ending up in a proper decision. Okay, the charismatic leader can, in a situation, come and say, forget the rules. I will deliver things. Okay, so it can in fact be revolutionary, and of course, Weber cites not just the example of Napoleon, as we see people like Cromwell, for instance, charismatic authority. There is no tradition behind these kinds of leaders. Napoleon, for instance, comes at a time when there are all these long established dynasties and everything is set aside, and he emerges, finally declares himself emperor with no traditional authority behind him. Now, one of the key problems, Weber says, with charismatic authority is the problem of succession. A charismatic, it's personal authority. So personal authority will die with the death or whatever, the absence of the charismatic leader. Can there be a succession in charismatic authority? And this problem of succession can be addressed through what Weber calls routinization. Adopt a routine procedure for continuing with charismatic authority. Or else it either becomes traditional authority, that is to say, it starts with the charismatic leader, but ends up as traditional authority. Okay, so let's say a dynastic monarchy. It becomes finally a dynastic monarchy in the sense in which any dynastic monarchy is traditional. Or it could end up land into a rational system. It can start with charismatic authority, but end up in a rational bureaucratic system. Neither of these is routinization. So Weber thinks of at least 3 or 4 possibilities, searching for a new leader with the same qualities. He mentions particularly the way in which the Dalai Lama is chosen. Right, as you know, when a Dalai Lama dies or is about to die or has aged, right? A child is identified somewhere who is supposed to have the same qualities as the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama is meant to be the incarnation of the Buddha. So there are signs by which supposedly a child can be identified as having those qualities. This is a routinization, and of course, as Weber notes, this procedure of finding a Dalai Lama, it's continued in Tibetan Buddhism for many centuries now. Or, this is one procedure, or through revelation. That is to say, there are oracles or divine signals where the successor is identified and recognized as legitimate through some kind of revelation. God sends a signal through some means, which is accepted as legitimate. People accept. Acceptance is absolutely crucial, of course, for legitimacy. Third, designation by the original leader and recognized by followers. So this is also a possibility of routinization, so that the original charismatic leader identifies a successor and the followers accept, recognize this. Now, this may or may not happen because there are many instances where this identification of the successor has not been legitimized. So followers often refuse, or the followers were divided. That's also a possibility. That would lead to a disputed charismatic leadership. Maybe it could mean a fractured leadership, and the authority would not have the same legitimacy as before. So, or you could have, now this should not be the third, the fourth, I think, creating a line of hereditary charisma where the succession is accepted as legitimate. Hereditary charisma, this is actually turning into tradition. It actually should not be three. This is routinization, which ends up in charismatic authority becoming traditional, right? Where it ends up in a hereditary monarchy or a hereditary priesthood. So the original origin was in some charismatic leader, but it ends up in a priesthood which is tradition, right? A traditional order of priests. It would happen. This routinization is a way in which it loses the character of charismatic authority and becomes traditional. Weber actually does speak of the possibility of charismatic authority in modern states, in democracies. When recognition by many becomes the basis of legitimacy, charismatic leadership may acquire a democratic basis. What Weber calls plebiscitary democracy, democracy by plebiscite, meaning it's like a referendum. Every act, as it were, ends up in a referendum so that people are supposedly voting every time the leader says something or orders something. Here, personal following is legitimized by a plebiscite, i.e., a popular endorsement of personal leadership. And the examples Weber gives of Cromwell, Napoleon, and you could have modern party leaders. They become party leaders because, in a sense, there is a mass following who endorse through some actual act of voting or some kind of plebiscite or referendum. They endorse a particular leader and accept that leader's authority. Substantive justice is often enacted without formal procedure. So you could have arbitrary rules, arbitrary executive action, you could have tribunals. Hence, there is a conflict between charismatic authority and rational bureaucracy. Now, you can think of many contemporary situations in many countries where supposedly we have what today people are calling them populist leaders who are elected. Okay, so they have popular endorsement, but these populist leaders very often do not accept the limitations or the rules of formal bureaucratic authority, right? So when you have, for instance, even Donald Trump who says, well, I don't accept the result of this election. Okay, now there is a conflict between, and there are followers who endorse that claim, right? Then there is a conflict between charismatic authority and rational bureaucracy. Plebiscitary democracy and economic rationality. And once again, Weber is very much concerned about the possibilities of modern rational economic enterprise or capitalism, right? Which Weber is very clear has become the dominant way of economic life. Does plebiscitary democracy inhibit or promote economic rationality? A ruler by plebiscite will try to consolidate loyalty by military power or promoting the material well-being of followers. The aim will be to destroy traditional and patrimonial authority and create economic interests favorable to the regime, loyal to the regime. This may lead to formal, rational economy. Okay, it is possible that a plebiscitary leader will in fact promote rational economic activity because he may destroy the old forms of traditional authority which were inhibiting modern economic activity and create economic interests which are favorable to the regime. Particularly, Napoleon is an example which is often given, that even though Napoleon was clearly authoritarian and so on, what he achieved in that period of revolutionary rule was to break down many old feudal conventions and practices and institutions, and institute a codified set of rules, right? The famous Napoleonic Code, okay, this new set of laws, supposedly rational laws, okay, which ended up promoting modern economic activity, because the traditional institutions which were standing in the way, the institutions of the aristocracy and the nobility and so on, they were, well, at least if not destroyed, they were certainly made weakened greatly. Okay, so this may lead to formal rational economy. On the other hand, the leader may impose substantive rather than formal justice in the economy, bypassing rules and procedures, and thus weaken rational bureaucracy. That's the second possibility. And in many cases, for instance, with more recent populist leaders, this is often alleged, right, that there is a pressure to deliver substantive justice, right, deliver benefits, direct benefits to the poor, to one's large mass of supporters, right? Direct benefits which are contrary to formal, rational, bureaucratic reasoning, okay, or procedures. This weakens rational bureaucracy. And of course, many charismatic leaders, in fact, demand a kind of personal loyalty of rational bureaucracy, of members of the bureaucracy, which is completely contradictory to the logic of rational bureaucracy, because it is supposed to be adherence to rules, but populist leaders or charismatic leaders very often demand personal loyalty, which may not respect the rules. In fact, charismatic leaders very often defy the rules on the ground that I'm doing this in order to deliver benefits to the people. This could lead to arbitrary decisions, cronyism, and corruption. But very interestingly, corruption may be accepted by the followers if material benefits are assured. And that clearly is an important part of the logic of populist leadership and populist politics today. So all of this is Weber's understanding of the three different kinds of the pure types of legitimate authority. And he is also pointing out to the many ways in which we don't see the pure types anymore. But even in the most recent periods, there are possibilities of, whereas one of his key observations is that irrational bureaucratic institutions come to prevail or dominate most institutions of modern life. That becomes the dominant form of authority, the most preferred rational form of authority. But there are many admixtures. There are mixtures of traditional authority in the form of, let's say, supposedly discretionary power of the heads of institutions, or much more interestingly, the mixture of charismatic authority with rational bureaucratic authority, which we see very often in contemporary democracies. So let me stop there, and we can take a few questions if you have questions.
Thank you, Partha. Questions, please. বাংলাতেও প্রশ্ন করা যায়। Kaushik, you want to go first? Aparna maybe. Whoever. Rajoshi, you want to go first?
So, I mean, it's a very vague question, but shall I?
Sure, go ahead.
So, sir, I was just thinking, so if, according to Weber, uh, authority basically means legitimate domination, uh, how would this legitimacy actually emerge? I, I mean, that particular emergence, does it have any conditions?
Well, as for instance, if it is charismatic authority, then clearly it emerges all of a sudden. There is no rational explanation of why a particular charismatic leader comes to be accepted as legitimate. So whether in the field of religion, why is a particular prophet, why does a prophet acquire a following? Okay, there is no specific rational explanation of something like that. It happens, and of course, one knows of many people who claim to be prophets and never acquire a following. Okay, so why some people, claim to having these kinds of exceptional powers, and sometimes, it's not necessarily that these people claim it themselves. Others claim it on their behalf. That is also possible, right? That so-and-so person has miraculous powers, okay? And so people keep coming to them. Do they have results? Is it on the basis of actual results that they come to believe in the powers of that person? We don't know. There are many, many accounts and studies of that phenomenon. But some people acquire this power, and once the power has been acquired, then there is an interesting question about how that authority continues to gain legitimacy. Remember, legitimacy is habitual, right? A regular obedience to authority. How does charismatic authority become habitual? And there's an important question that Weber raises, that it may not last long, it may not survive the person, which is very often the case, right? That charismatic authorities do not have successors or fail to get a proper succession, and then it goes away. Okay. What about traditional? Now, how does traditional authority acquire legitimacy? It can only acquire legitimacy over a long time. That is to say, it is at some point that people say that, oh, this is something that we have always done it this way. And so this is how it must be in future. Sometimes you will get this. There will be tests. That is to say, there may well be situations of a particular crisis of a particular leader or a particular state order or a religious order, right? A crisis in the institution, at which point tradition will be asserted, right? These are matters of specific histories, but traditions will be asserted. Somebody, some person or some body of leaders will assert that this has been our tradition. This is how it has always been done, and this is how we must continue to do it. So it is through these kinds of assertions from point to point that you could say a tradition becomes legitimized, right? Rational bureaucracy is a much more direct way in which it becomes legitimized. It becomes legitimized through formal procedures. So it is a question of actually an institution actually exercising its domain, its authority over a particular set of practices. So, for instance, if you think of the Indian situation, right? When did the modern state order come to acquire authority? Now, you can, let's say the British colonial power in India. You can go back to the 18th century and certainly claim that even in the areas with the East India Company conquered, right, and established itself, its authority was not necessarily considered legitimate. It did not extend everywhere. It is very clear, even in the early days of the British Raj, for instance, after the suppression of the mutiny, etc., it's very clear that the authority actually of the state order, the rational bureaucratic order, it extended to the principal sort of presidency towns, right? The major capital urban centers, especially those places where there were significant European population. Those areas were clearly, there was a regular, rational, bureaucratic order of a state, a set of officials, a set of courts, a set of police, and so on, which exercised its rational bureaucratic order. But if you went into the countryside, well, there were traditional authorities of all kinds, right, which continue to have authority. You would have, landlords, zamindars, you would have tribal chiefs, you would have caste leaders, all of those kinds of people who had traditional authority, continue to have traditional authority, right? Certainly, even in the most recent period, even today, you could make the argument that even though, for instance, take something like the laws of the state in relation to the family. Okay, now the state has made laws about the family, about marriage, inheritance, and so on and so forth. We know that in large parts of the country, those laws are not accepted as legitimate. So, for instance, you take something like the age of marriage. Okay, there is a specific law about when men or women at what age they can get legally married. That is on the basis of a rational set of principles. These laws have been. But we all know that in large parts of the country, you have child marriage, even today. So it's an understanding that in that respect, at least, the present regime of laws, of rational laws, does not necessarily have the legitimacy that it claims, right, over many specific institutions, even though they have laws, they have made laws for those things. So that's the important question here. If there is legitimacy, the test is that orders will be habitually or routinely followed. Claiming that one has legitimacy does not necessarily mean they have legitimacy. Don't forget that Weber's basic first definition, domination, even from, is their actual exercise of power. The probability that orders will be obeyed. The probability. So you judge from the consequences. So your question, how does the legitimacy first come into place? You have to judge from the consequences. From what time or which point of or which event can, or which set of people, relations between authorities and their subjects, can you say that following orders or obedience has become routine or habitual? That's the point from which you can say, well, it's become legitimate. Or legitimacy can also collapse after a point of time. It can be legitimate, and then at some point, because of various events, because of some sense of crisis, legitimacy can collapse.
Thank you, sir. Also, sir, could I ask one more question?
Yes, please.
So I was wondering in terms of this classification, this tripartite classification, what kind of authority would Hobbes' sovereign represent?
Very interesting question. Um, you see, Hobbes' sovereign is, technically speaking, not traditional, although it is uh, it is purely it is absolute. There are no formal limits on what that sovereign can or cannot do, because the subjects no longer have rights against the sovereign. Okay, the sovereign does not. So the basic rule of for first of all, it is not traditional because it is understood to be an elected sovereign, right? It is understood to be a sovereign that has been chosen by the people themselves through a contract among them, to which the sovereign is no longer a party, is not a party. So it does not necessarily, it is not by tradition that the monarch becomes sovereign. It is because the people have chosen the monarch that the monarch becomes the Leviathan. But on the other hand, is it rational legal? Hard to decide, because of course it is meant, there are no rules that bind. Okay, so then the final um, authority at the head of the state is not bound by any rules. Absolute. Okay, so that authority is not subject to rational bureaucracy. But the entire argument that Hobbes supplies as to why the people will choose or must choose a sovereign of this kind is a rational argument. It's a completely rational argument. It is not a traditional argument. And it is not an appeal to charisma either. You know, the Hobbes' sovereign is not a prophet. Hobbes' sovereign is not chosen because the sovereign can do miracles. Okay? So one way of thinking of this is, of course, to suggest that rational bureaucracy actually needs a founding moment, which requires an absolute authority, someone who has absolute authority. It's once that absolute authority has been identified and established, then under, as it were, the benign supervision of that absolute authority, you can have a rational form of government. In fact, you should have a rational form of government, right? Where there are rules and laws and so on, which will be applied consistently and without arbitrariness, right? But the founding moment, cannot be subject to any rule, because who gives the rules then, right? So Hobbes is actually trying to solve a problem here where he is not saying that the rules are given from outside, the rules are not given by scripture, the rules are not given by God, the rules are not given by miraculous powers, okay? The rules are not given by tradition. But who gives the rules then? The people give themselves the rules. But how can they do that? Right? So all that the people do, they take a completely rational decision to give up all their natural rights, hand it over to this one person who they say, well, you are our ruler. You have absolute powers. You tell us what we must do. And this ruler will then preside over a rational system of rules and practices. Okay? In some ways, see, Weber doesn't say this. In some ways, the owner of a capitalist organization, the private owner of a private capitalist organization, has somewhat this position, if you think of it that way. You know, somebody like Elon Musk has this kind of position, right? He is the absolute owner, and so has absolute power, and is now laying down rules. Now, are these rules rational, and so on and so forth? Weber's argument would be that if this has to be a successful, long-lasting capitalist organization, then its institutional rules must in fact be rational, bureaucratic. It cannot be arbitrary. Okay, so over time it will have to be that. But to the extent that a business organization is privately owned by a single person, that person is outside the domain of rational authority. Okay, and is in that sense the founder. And that founding moment or that founding authority cannot be subjected to the forms of rational or traditional authority. So, but that's an interesting question.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Partha, I know it's been long, but may I ask one question? Just
Yes, final question.
yeah. So I'll keep it brief. I'll not ask the other two questions I have. So, you know, what was according, so if we look at the, you know, the way, and I'm approaching the problem from a sociological vantage point here. So what, according to Weber, would be the relationship between ideas and practices? See, you yourself mentioned how, you know, in pockets of India in the 18th century, we see the emergence of, you know, certain modern forms of rule. But if we think of, and Weber, even if he had got many things wrong about the religion of India and China, it is generally considered that his observations on Chinese bureaucracy to be very astute. And if we think of, say, the work of somebody like Benjamin Ellman, who talks about a certain emergence of certain forms of rationality, emergence of certain forms of rational governmental practices in pre-colonial China. So what we see then is that there are rational governmental practices are emerging both in Europe and in China, but there are under very different intellectual regimes. Considering the theories of sovereignty in operation, the theories of kingship in operation, in these two domains are very different. So what then would be Weber's take on, say, the relationship with ideas and practices?
See, very interesting that you asked this question. Certainly in relation to China, Weber is suggesting that the rise and institutionalization of the Chinese bureaucracy, the sort of Mandarin system, that places a limit on traditional authority. That is to say, the Mandarinate exercises a kind of limit on the authority of the monarch and the traditional other traditional rulers. So it becomes a kind of hybrid system. It's not a pure traditional authority anymore. It comes to be limited. But on the other hand, rational bureaucracy does not take over and occupy the entire institution, right? It remains a kind of hybrid system. In the European case, to the extent that even if you think of early modern situations, there is clearly the rise of a rational bureaucratic order. There is a rise of rational economic practices and institutions, particularly what Weber identifies as the rise of capitalism, right? But for a considerable time, this coexists with a traditional authority, both in the domain of religion as well as in the domain of the state. It sort of runs parallel. Now, interestingly, then you have what in Europe would be called revolution. So in Britain, you have something like Cromwell. Cromwell emerges from within a kind of religious establishment, a religious order, a non-conformist religious order, among the Puritans and so on. And there is a revolution against traditional authority. Now, this doesn't necessarily last there. It is restored and so on. So in the case of England, as we know it, there is never a clean break from one to the other. But you could think initially of this sort of hybrid system continuing for a long time with a clear trajectory of the growing rise of rational bureaucratic authority over the traditional. Even though, for instance, even in the realm of the state, the monarchy doesn't go away. Even today, you have traces of this monarchy, although the monarchy, you could say, is almost completely circumscribed by a rational bureaucratic order. So the monarch cannot be, and you have clear instances, occasions where the authority, the arbitrary authority of the monarch has been continuously limited more and more. Until now, you could say that it's almost non-existent, even though it is there. But in the French case, you have a more thoroughgoing revolution. The rise of somebody like Napoleon, right? And through the 19th century, you could argue that first in the domain of the state, in its rational legal organization of the entire legal codes, which come to prevail, even though Napoleon is overthrown, the Napoleonic Code continues. All those legal enactments, because in a sense, those were seen to be consistent with the new order, the demands of the new economic organization of society. So, and to the extent that you would accept that the driving force of historical change through the 19th century is the growing economic power of a certain bourgeoisie. To that extent, it is consistent with the rise of rational legal authority until you come to a constitutional system where the monarchy is completely abolished, right? You have elected presidents, etc., etc. In the American case, of course, there was no traditional authority to speak of except the imperial one, which is overthrown. So in many of these cases, what you would have, if you were to take a Weberian view, where you would have hybrid systems, where traditional authority is circumscribed by the rational bureaucratic ones. And then through specific historical events, occasions, right? Critical events, traditional authority is either completely overthrown and destroyed, or in a kind of reformist way, over time, gradually subsumed and dominated by the rational legal form.
Thanks a lot, Partha. So you don't have to respond to this, but I think because it's getting quite late, in fact. So, but I think what What we really need to do is critique Weber's own ideas of rationality itself. Like, if it,
Sure.
yeah, I mean, if you think of, you know, the benchmarks of capitalism and rationality that he's thinking of, say, the double entry accounting system.
Yeah, yeah.
And if we look at historians like Laurent Daston, we know how
Yeah.
much arbitrariness went into
Sure.
making of these rational forms. And
Sure.
the interesting thing is that Weber, as far as I have read him, never reflects on his own, you know, his own condition. Like with his long history of mental illness, and he taking in terms of his profession what would have been considered very irrational decisions, right? He had to
You see,
resign
this is
from.
a very, very interesting question that you raised. In a lot of, you know, even though Weber is clearly defining, for instance, in terms of the spirit of capitalism, this entire argument about rational bureaucracy being the most rational system known in history, etc., etc. It is not clear that Weber actually ever completely endorses either capitalism or bureaucracy as desirable system. It is not clear at all, at all. In fact, one of the things that Weber, you see, the phrase that Weber uses at least 3 or 4 times in the works that I have seen. The iron cage.
Iron cage of modernity,
This is
right?
the iron cage of modernity, the iron cage of rationality. These are terms that he often uses, which is almost to say that some kind of, you know, natural spontaneity of, you know, human life is taken away. It's taken away by this. So it is, you know, Weber is far more ambiguous about the sort of ethical or moral virtues of modernity and capitalism that would appear from many of these texts, right? Which he is clearly interpreting. His idea of interpretive is to try and understand what is going on inside, right? To come to some kind of pure type. And his pure type or ideal type
Right,
is his
the
method.
ideal type, yeah.
Is his method. So he is, as it was, presenting what is, from the point of view of rational bureaucracy, what is the ideal system, right? Now, any real world situation will not be of this kind. And then if you try understand why it is not of this kind, of the ideal type,
right?
What are the other elements coming in? Then, of course, that is precisely showing up the actual limitations of that ideal type itself, right? What are the limitations of rational bureaucracy that makes it impossible to have a purely rational bureaucratic system anyway?
I think we should stop here. Thank you, Partha. It was excellent as usual. And Weber's relationship with modernity is pretty much like your relationship with political society, you know. 20 years from now, people will say, you know, Chatterjee never said it was a very moral or a ethical form of governance.
I hope I've never said that.
No, I don't think you have never made a moral judgment on anything. So thank you very much, Partha. Thanks a lot. Yeah. So